Greetings from the dark continent. Conscious Caracal here. And tonight, for the season finale of my election-themed interviews, I have John Steenhuisen from the DA, the Chief Whip, to tell us a bit more about, as we enter now the crunch time, the last 100 meters till the 8th of May, when everything will be decided. We are going to chat a bit about what this entails, what his party has achieved up until now, and just be taking your questions in the live chat as well. Welcome to the show, John. You can take the liberty now to give the audience a bit of an idea of who you are and why they should care.
Sure. Thanks, Ernst. And may I just say what a great privilege it is to be with you and, of course, all the people that are watching live this evening in this finale. We're 3 days away from the 8th of May, which is going to be an important election in South Africa, I believe. But about me, my name is John Steenhuisen. As you've said, I'm the Chief Whip of the Democratic Alliance in the National Assembly. I've been a elected public representative since the age of 22. I've served at a council level, I've served in the provincial legislature, and of course I've served in parliament. And I really enjoy politics. I see politics as a way of changing society, of being able to make things better for our citizens, and a means of achieving a new future for South Africa that I believe the country desperately needs. As we sit here this evening, we've got 10 million people unemployed, an economy that's not growing at all, 0.8%, a civil service that's out of control in terms of its size, and a government that's riddled with corruption and maladministration. And unless we have change, we're not going to be able to get South Africa onto that new trajectory of hope, prosperity, and inclusiveness for all South Africans.
Now, just something trivial. Where did this nickname of yours come from, that you are a street fighter in Parliament?
Well, I was called a street fighter by Fikile Mbalula, who used it as an insult. I then turned it around and took it as an absolute accolade. You know, when the ANC accused you of being a street fighter, I was happy to appropriate it and say I'm a street fighter for democracy. Arose the very hard fight around getting rid of President Jacob Zuma at the time, and it's something I wear as a badge of honor now. South Africa's most famous matriculant, but also South Africa's most famous street fighter.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to get to that as well. I mean, we had a bit of a, in quotation marks, scandal that when it was revealed that you only have a matric. But I mean, for someone with only a matric, I don't see what the problem really seems to be. You seem to be doing pretty well and pretty impressive in terms of your career. Now, something else that I noticed is that we are entering now the crunch time, the last 100 meters. For the DA itself, what is left now? What are you trying to cram in right now just before the 8th of May? What is your key or your major priority at this moment?
Well, it's all going to come down to turnout in the key battleground election provinces, particularly in Gauteng and the Western Cape. But in this election, more than any other election than ever before, every single vote's going to count. So shaking as many hands as possible, speaking to as many people as possible about spreading our message of hope and change. I was out this afternoon with Alan Windey on the Cape Flats, Mitchell's Plain in Philippi, in Johannesburg yesterday with Musi Maimani and the rest of the Team 1SA there, just trying to convince as many South Africans that if they want change, they've got to go out and vote for it. Sitting back and expecting it just to happen is not going to take place. You need to be actively involved in your future. And the only way to do that is by getting out there and exercising your democratic right and voting, hopefully for the Democratic Alliance. But people have got to get out and vote. There's no such thing as not voting. Sitting at home is as good as a vote for the status quo. And if you're unhappy with the status quo, you've got to get out there and vote.
Well, at the moment, we are sitting in a situation where I think the only real remedy is, as we were talking before the interview started, the idea of regular people rolling up their sleeves and start just doing in their own capacity, start doing something to improve their communities and their country around them. So I do think that is already a message that I'm trying to promote this year specifically, is this idea of, in Afrikaans, is the best way to say it is self-doen, where you're not going to wait for someone else that's smarter or better spoken or stronger or more influential than you to bring the change that you want, but rather to be that change in your own tiny capacity, whether you be an influential person or just a regular person like me with a microphone. So now, seeing as we have the luxury of hindsight, what are what has been the main achievement of the DA since the previous election, seeing as since 2014 you have had quite a few years to leave your mark on South Africa in quite a number of voids left by the ANC?
Well, I think the most significant transition in that particular period for the Democratic Alliance has been our transition from a party of opposition into a party of government. As you know, we now are in government in the province of the Western Cape, the city of Cape Town, Johannesburg and Tshwane. We were in Nelson Mandela Bay, but also in countless municipalities around the country. And I think the key takeaway from that is that clean and accountable government means that people's lives get better. So what we've been able to achieve, for instance, in the Western Cape with economic growth, the national growth rate's been 0.8%. In the same period in the Western Cape, it was 2.4%. Working with government, working with business, together in a partnership with government, you're able to achieve things. Government cannot do everything on its own, and it's essential that it partners with business, with civil society to bring that change that you spoke about earlier. We now have a situation just 10 years down the line after Helen Zille and her cabinet were given an opportunity here in the Western Cape, where we have an 83% clean audit rate in the province. We've created over 500,000 new jobs in the Western Cape in that period. In the last year, 50% of the new jobs in the country that were created here in the Western Cape, the DA-run Western Cape, which shows that when you put the right people around the table with the right policies and with the right implementation, you can actually get the right results. Keeping the same old people around the same table, making the same bad decisions, you're going to get the same bad outcome. I think that's a key message from this election. We've shown that we can bring change. But everyone else talks about job creation. We're doing job creation. Everyone talks about growing an economy. We've grown an economy. Everyone talks about education that prepares people for the future. We've delivered that education that prepares for the future. Clean, accountable government equals people's lives getting better and more opportunity for more of our citizens.
Now, seeing as you've covered the big achievements that you reached in the past since the previous election, with any positive, there's also a negative. Now, in terms of not only what you've achieved, but also what are the big challenges that have emerged in the past since the previous election that weren't there before?
Well, I think that if one looks back, particularly at 2018, I think the DA spent far too much time internally focused rather than speaking to our core voters. And we had a few internal incidents from the Dalil matter to various other things. And I think that was a distraction. But I think we've started 2019 off having learned from what happened in 2018, being able to realize what we needed to do. And I think we've been on the front foot since we got back in January, running a campaign that's positive, that's setting forward a future-focused vision for South Africa. We can't go back and fix yesterday. Nobody can. We've got to own the future. And I think that's been the focus, particularly for the DA over this period. And I think 2018 was a difficult year for us. I think we made a number of missteps. And I think we've all learned from that. And we're moving forward as we go towards this election and beyond for what the DA needs to do to build that new inclusive future for South Africa, to get us off this low growth, high debt trajectory onto a trajectory of growth and opportunity for more citizens.
I see some smart asses in the chat have been saying that you're literally on fire if you just look behind you.
I am indeed.
So yeah, now to take that a bit further, in terms of you being a pretty salted politician and someone that's been in the game quite a long time, what if you compare this election season? I mean, there's a lot of people that seem to be suffering from election fever if you just look around you. But if you look at it right now in terms of the campaign that we've seen from all the major parties in South Africa, what has been one big difference in terms of 2019 compared to the election campaigns and election seasons of the previous years?
Well, I think voters are expecting solutions more than ever before. I think the last few elections have been very easy. You simply put up, for instance, the Zumas and the like, and you say to people, that's what's wrong with South Africa. They're the problem. I think certainly being on the hustings and being around the country, visiting every corner of all provinces, people are looking for solutions. They're looking for that ladder of opportunity out of the situation that they're in now to get them into a better situation. And it doesn't matter whether you're a shack dweller in Khayelitsha or a mansion owner in Saxonwold, people are putting more pressure on political parties to come up with meaningful means in which they're going to be able to deliver a better future for South Africa. And I think it's good. I think that it's right for citizens to be more demanding on politicians and elected public representatives. And I think it's a healthy development, because just simply setting up a straw man and beating the straw man is not going to get the country moving forward. I think you've got to be far more solutions oriented. And that's why I'm so proud of our manifesto. It's 72 pages of solutions that are birthed out of our experience in government, both locally and provincially, which we believe is going to make a tremendous difference from getting us from the situation we're in now into a more prosperous future for all citizens, no matter where you are.
Something else that must have definitely changed since the previous election is just the mainstream media environment. Maybe it hasn't, but I'm curious to know, have you seen any change recently in terms of how the media reports on the DA, how the media treats the DA in general? Has there been anything that has caught your eye, or has it pretty much stayed the same?
No, it's definitely been a lot more hostile in this particular election and a lot more unprofessional. I certainly think when you look at it, for instance, the Sunday Times today, the Sunday Times has largely become a cheerleading rag for President Cyril Ramaphosa. And if you look at a variety of the articles that are set out today, from Peter Bruce's misguided Kool-Aid analysis of how we got to vote for the very people who got us into this problem to get us out of the problem, to the articles in there, a lot more hostile towards the DA. And we've had to rely a lot more on people like you, people like Ronaldo Gous and other online platforms to be able to get the message to people. And I think it's a welcome development, the type of interactions we're seeing both with you this evening and that I've had with various other platforms that are looking at alternative ways of speaking to people. I think with the death of the print media industry, independent newspapers is a write-off. It's completely non-independent. It's moribund, and it's being used by Iqbal Survey to buy favor with a variety of other people. These types of platforms that you've got this evening, I think, are going to be far more important going forward as we discuss ideas and debate each other as South Africans. Lazy journalism, you put a picture of the EFF disrupting a meeting in their red overalls on the front page, and that passes for news. Gone is the in-depth analysis. Gone is the critical analysis. There's very few news outlets that have it. I think the Daily Maverick is probably one of our leading places where you can still get unfiltered news. But I'm very disappointed in print media, particularly in this election. You seem to have become fawning objects of political use across the board.
Right. Now, I would like to stay on this topic, because this is definitely something that I've noticed, just as a regular South African, keeping up to date with politics going on in this country. Now, not as maybe this is not maybe a DA-centric question, but just from your experience, where do you think this change in gears come from? Where's this? I mean, it's not like South Africa doesn't have good journalists. It's not like we don't have excellent top-class investigative journalists. But where's this almost a drop in quality, or a drop in objectivity almost? Where's this coming from? What is fueling it, just from your perspective?
Well, I think particularly when one looks at print media, it's largely a juniorization of the newsrooms. Newspapers are not prepared to pay top-quality journalists what they are worth anymore, and have purged the newsrooms and journalist floors of experienced people capable of proper analysis in favor of cheap, varsity graduates or technicon graduates who are then sent out to just churn out content. And I think it's been a huge disappointment. I mean, for instance, you could pick up a copy of the New York Times or the Financial Times. It takes you a good few hours to get through the content. Do yourself a favor and pick up a KZN Mercury or a Daily News or a Cape Argus. You're through the thing within a few minutes. There's very little that passes for proper critical analysis. And I think that it's far easier for journalists to just slip into the mainstream analysis, where you then simply all reinforce each other's views, rather than adopting that critical analysis that's required of all parties. I mean, I want people to critically analyze what the DA is saying. I want to be able to engage with people who are critical of the party and critical of our policies, and be given an opportunity, to talk about them. what passes for journalism these days is you just take the press releases that get pushed out from the presidency, or you, as I say, you just take a picture of the EFF disrupting Parliament, and that's the news. We need far more critical analysis, and I think we need far more professionalism in our newsrooms if the fourth estate is going to do and perform the role that it has to in a functioning democracy, which is providing that critical analysis and analyzing the news rather than just simply reporting it.
And on that topic, something that got a lot of people interested or entertained was an exchange between Helen Ziller and Max Dupree on Twitter recently, where Max tweeted out something along the lines of, he can't believe after all these gaffes and all these blunders of the ANC, they seem to be still going to get above 50% support. And then Helen Ziller quite savagely replied, well, it's because of friends like you, Max. And I mean, this is the same Max Dupree that just a few months ago told us in his column that we need to strengthen Ramaphosa's hand and give him a mandate. So we do seem to have a problem with these types of hyper-partisans almost in the media, where they seem to be almost lack a form of self-awareness, where they can't even see how blatantly they are using their position or their respected reputation to promote their own political views or their own political leanings. And I don't think this is a South African phenomenon. I think this is a global phenomenon that we've seen, where genuine investigative journalism is no longer being done, or critical journalism rather, is no longer being done by just the top brass anymore. It's coming from regular people doing the digging, doing the investigation that journalism used to be. And I think that's the future, like you said. The future of media, I think, just as TV killed the radio star, I think the internet is definitely killing the TV anchor. And I think that's the new phase. That's where we're going towards, where everything is moving online. And if political parties, such as the DA specifically, cannot adapt to this type of new environment, this new media scene almost, I think that will be to their absolute detriment in the long run. Do you have any comments on that observation?
I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, I've been talking to colleagues about it for the last few weeks, as we've suffered under this very hostile media. And I think that Max is by no means the biggest instigator. I think probably the worst instigator in this election has been Peter Bruce, who I think has abused his column in the Business Day and the Sunday Times to basically run a cheerleading campaign for Cyril Ramaphosa. And his flawed analysis is so deeply flawed, that one beggars how he's going to have credibility after this election. His argument is that in order to strengthen, South Africa, we've got to strengthen the very party that's got us into the situation that we're in. And he's got this utopian view that, a majority for Cyril is going to mean that he can fix the ANC. The guy's not even in charge of his own party. Ace Magashule is in charge of his own party. In terms of your analysis, it's spot on. What we have to do is be able to talk directly to citizens and over the heads of these false prophets like Max and Peter, who abuse their columns to be able to drive a certain political agenda, to be able to talk to people directly about our offer and discuss critically these things. And so some of my best engagements and some of the most rewarding interactions this election have not been with mainstream journalists, I found very disappointing in this election, but with people like the Renegade Report, people like yourself, people like Ronaldo, who are willing to get politicians on to discuss the nuts and bolts and to have an engagement around ideas in an unmoderated way, so that people can actually just understand what the key issues are and engage with them. I think that's definitely the future for South Africa. We've got to speak past these gatekeepers of ideology and analysis who prevent the public from seeing the full picture and prevent skewed views, and preventing the real engagement from taking place. So I'd much rather be seeing more conscious Caracals than Peter Bruce waxing lyrical in the Sunday Times and the Business Day.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. In terms of, I think a big safety mechanism in terms of this format that I do, I mean, it's live. So I can't really go out and, like the traditional media do, cut it up into smaller sections and really just take some of your statements out of context. And I could really do a lot of damage in terms of just painting you as something that you are not, by just using cleverly edited pieces of media, or even just quoting you out of context in a column or when I report on something you said. And I do think that is one of the big attractive parts of people like me and Ronaldo Gous and people like the Renegade Report. The fact that I think people are tired of the classic news anchor that sits there with his gray hair and his six-figure salary and his nice suit and everything, and just sitting there reading off a teleprompter. They would much rather watch a show of some guy sitting in his room doing an interview that feels like one of them, someone that they just had a beer with a few hours ago. It feels like someone, I mean, not just that it feels like it, it is someone that is not being controlled by, for example, corporate donors or some type of other interest groups or advertisers. It is very much a very direct line between politicians and the regular citizens or supporters. And I think that's why a lot of politicians or political figures are actually shying away from coming on shows like mine or any other similar format, because it's very direct. It's not, they can't afterwards expect, for example, an interview with one of their mates in the media to nicely polish their image and add a little bit of flair to it. This is very much raw, just you giving answers. But there's also
a lot more authentic, and I think that's what we're looking for, is authenticity. In a advent of fake news and scripted politicians, people want authenticity. And want to see their politicians, I think, flaws and all. We're humans, and I think that's what people like to see as well. And we're not automatons or robots. You know, we're humans. We make mistakes. We have to bear the everyday burdens that most South Africans do. You know, we're ordinary people. We're not some superhuman people that are, just because you bear a title in front or behind your name, you're suddenly elevated into this position where you're better than everybody else. We're regular people, and who've just chosen politics as a vehicle to improve the lives of South Africans and make a difference.
Right. Now, to take the conversation back to the DA itself, and since we are talking about adaptation and the changing of the times, what has been one major adaptation that you have had to do in recent times in terms of just the change in technology or the media landscape even?
Well, it's about changing, you know, who we speak to. You know, it's very easy to speak to an audience that's all the same color, speaks the same language, or worships the same God. I think if we're to take South Africa forward, what we need is an alternative in South Africa to the ANC. And that means that we need to do what the DA is doing at the moment, which I think is an historic mission, which is to bring different South Africans together from different backgrounds, different religions, different experiences into a party that is able to then provide a front against the ANC. You know, the ANC's dream for South Africa is to simply divide people up into little categories of race, of culture, of religion, of experience, of economic situation, and keep them separate, because it's a lot easier to just push them out the way then. Their biggest nightmare is a consolidated party at the center of politics in South Africa that's bringing South Africans together, which is why our message in this election is such a positive one. It's one South Africa for all. We're saying to the ANC, you will not divide us. We're saying to the BLF and the EFF, you know, you will not divide us. We will come together as South Africans around these values and principles of fairness, transparency, the Constitution, the rule of law, a free market system for South Africa. And we're going to coalesce around them. And we're not going to allow you to bring in these arbitrary divisions that you've relied on for so long to keep us apart. We're coming together. And I think that has been the big transition for the DA, away from sort of the small party syndrome to becoming a broad organization. And it's not been without its challenges. I'm not saying to you for a moment that it's been easy. This is a tough role that the DA has chosen. It's far easier to sit and have a party for Afrikaans people where everybody sounds and talks the same, or a party for isiZulu people in KwaZulu-Natal where everyone's of the same culture, or a party for colored people in the Western Cape where everyone has the same skin color. This is the challenge of the DA, and it's something we're working at. Have we got it right every step of the way? Probably not. Have we got a lot further than any other party in South Africa? I think absolutely. And I think that's the core mission of the DA, and it's that's been I think the core change of the DA over the course of the last 10 to 15 years.
Right. Now, I think something that makes South Africa so interesting is the fact that the country is an absolute paradox. So while you have rich on one side, poor on the other side, white on one side, black on the other side, first world country, third world country, I think it's a country of paradoxes and a country of contrasts. And something that I do think is still very interesting about the country is the idea that even though you are still making all these adaptations in terms of new technology, new ways of doing things, new ways of campaigning, there's still a very gritty, down to earth strategy in terms of campaigning, and so especially the rural areas. I think I saw the other day a stat that South Africa is like the fourth most rural country in the world in terms of where 35% of the population is still living in rural areas. Now, my question there would be, what are you doing in terms as the DA in terms of reaching these rural South Africans that don't have access to the internet or social media, and that might be struggling through life in terms of not really focusing on keeping up to date in terms of what's happening in the bigger picture, but rather just focusing on their own little personal sphere or their own small world that they just are trying to keep stable and to keep happy?
Yeah, look, I mean, you're absolutely right. And this is a challenging area for the DA particularly. And not that we're not getting out there, it's just that those areas, and it's been one of the hardest things for me to witness traveling around the country in this election, to some of the most far-flung, rural, forgotten communities in our country, to just see how our rural economies have collapsed, how rural towns have collapsed. I mean, 5 years ago, I was out doing the same thing I'm doing now. There's been a noticeable decline in those economies. There's small towns where shops are boarded up. I was in Venterstad a few weeks ago, and our bustling town centres now boarded up, derelict buildings, one or two foreign-owned shops that are there, and it's just been terrifying to watch the collapse of this rural economy as this government's policies on agrarian reform and on the economy have destroyed small and rural communities. And those communities are very vulnerable now because the majority of them are completely reliant on government grant funding. So I've been visiting communities where there's 9 or 10 people living off the grandmother's old age pension, state pension. And these voters become very vulnerable to the messages that the ANC drive, that, if you don't vote for the DA, your grant's going to be stopped. I mean, the irony is that in the Western Cape, where the DA governs, we have the best, most clean and accountable measure of ensuring grants are paid. And that this is not ANC money that's being used to pay these grants. It's taxpayers' money. It's your and my money that's being used to fund these. And so for the ANC to portray themselves as being the dispensers of that grant is simply wrong. So it's tough ground. But what we've been doing is visiting those communities and talking to people. And I've spent a lot of time in Limpopo, in the Eastern Cape, and the Northern Cape, speaking to these forgotten communities and placing that ladder of opportunity that the DA's manifesto offers into those communities and into those homes, and saying, look, we know why you're here. These are the reasons why you're here, but this is what we want to do to get you out of the situation. This is what we want to do to make sure you've got a clinic within 90 minutes of your home. What we want to do to make sure that your children are attending a school where the teacher's pitching up for work and where they're getting a quality of education that will prepare them for the changing economy to come. We want to create a rural safety network for you to ensure that you're safe when you're traveling to and from your home or to and from your business or being on your farm. And it's sharing that message of hope and change and giving them something to hope for that I think works best in those communities. But of course, that's not what the tuna are for parties like the DA. Our big growth is going to be in urban and peri-urban centres. That's not to say we're not campaigning in rural areas. We have to. We're going to every corner of the country, speak to people in their language, having meetings, etc. But the big change, I think, is going to come in the urban and peri-urban areas, where the large majority of particularly young South Africans are looking for a party that can speak to the future, a party that's completely obsessed with fixing the future rather than obsessing about how we can go back and fix the past, which is impossible.
Right. Just before we go on, I would just like to welcome Neil Pretorius, watching all the way from South Korea, one of my previous flatmates in Stellenbosch. Thanks for tuning in, Neil. I really appreciate it. But yeah, seeing as we're talking about rural South Africa in general, something that my audience specifically cares a lot about is rural security, something that would over-encompass, for example, something like farm murders.
Sure.
Now, what would the DA do in terms of your policies to increase rural security and to counteract something like the farm murder epidemic that we are experiencing in South Africa?
Well, first of all, I think you've got to admit you've got a problem. And this is where I have a fundamental disagreement with President Ramaphosa. We have a problem with farm murders in South Africa. The longer you put your head in the sand about it, the longer it's going to take to come to a solution to that particular issue. Then you've got to go back and look at the genesis of the problem. There was a disbandment in around 2003, 2004 of the commando system in South Africa, which had been largely responsible for rural safety. That was removed under the then Defence Minister and under the then President, Thabo Mbeki. And we were then promised at that time that there was going to be a new rural safety policing model that was implemented. It never came. And so there's been a vacuum for that period in our rural communities. And into that vacuum has stepped crime, criminality, stock theft, and I think a level of brutality in murders that I think is largely driven by politicians and political rhetoric, that you're seeing the high levels of torture, of maiming of individuals, particularly of vulnerable elderly people across our rural communities. So we've got a plan to fix that. It centers mainly on getting boots on the ground and ensuring that you've got people doing patrolling and then resourcing those people to be able to perform the function. So what we're suggesting is a replacement of the commando system using the current police reservist model. We have a problem with rural unemployment. So we would see the recruitment and training of a large number of rural reservists who would then be trained to be able to police in those areas, and then resourcing them properly. You can't fight rural crime in a Toyota Corolla. You need a 4x4 vehicle. And then to harness technology in those areas, we've got new technology, particularly drones, which could be used to combat stock theft and going out there to track stock thieves and to be able to get eyes in the sky as quickly as possible on those routes that stock thieves use. And then, of course, you've got to make sure you've got a rural intelligence capacity. I think one of the biggest travesties in policing, both in a rural and an urban context, is the complete abuse and collapse of the crime intelligence unit within the SAPS, which has been used as a political football, as we know, with Mr. Burning and Clemeza and others who are far interested in playing politics and real intelligence. I think that if you start to join the dots in terms of these farm attacks, you'd start to find a common modus operandi, common purpose, and we'd be able to track them far quicker. But Ernst, one of the big things I've learned on the ground in this whole thing is actually weeding out bad elements within the SAPS. We've got over 4,000 members of the SAPS who've got criminal records themselves. And just chatting to, in various areas where I've been, where there've been stock theft particularly and farm murders, those units there I think have been infiltrated by people who are part of those syndicates. And I've been out on night patrol with the farmers in Burgersdorp in the Eastern Cape. And, I feel sorry for those farmers. They've got to get up at 5 in the morning. They've got to do their farming. And then at 6 in the evening, they get together and they patrol the area to prevent their families from being murdered and from their stock from being stolen. And, they shouldn't be doing that. That's a job the SAPS should be doing. And until we have an SAPS, an honest and effective SAPS, and we have a properly resourced and trained SAPS, we're not going to be able to meet the challenge. So our rural safety plan, I think, speaks to getting boots on the ground, resourcing those people, and then ensuring we have radio networks and harnessing technology to go hard after those individuals that are involved. And then we've got to be holding our politicians responsible. Now, with the best will in the world, if you're telling people kill the farmer, kill the boer, they feel they then have a mandate to go into our rural communities and do just that. And I think that the level of violence and the level of torture that we've seen in rural safety particularly, and let me tell you, it's black farmers that are bearing the brunt as well. It's not just a white farmer thing. There's black farmers that have been attacked on their farms. I think if you see that it is the level of political rhetoric that Mr. Malema and Mgatama and others are allowed to get away with, because we have a spineless Human Rights Commission who won't deal with the concept of hate speech fairly and effectively. We've got a spineless IEC, which allows these types of pronouncements in an election period that I think are all feeding into this. So I think it's an institutional issue, and I think it's a political issue that needs to be dealt with.
Right. No, thank you for that very detailed answer. This is definitely something that a lot of my listeners care a lot about. So I hope that gives them something to think about. Now, seeing as we're talking about politicians like Andile and Malema, what is the DA's stance on freedom of speech in terms of, let's take an example maybe to demonstrate your stance, in terms of something like the old South African flag? Do you think, seeing as this is something very relevant in the news right now, what is the DA's stance? Should certain symbols or words or speech be banned, or should there not be overstretching of our censorship capabilities, even if it means some people might still be offended?
Well, I'm a liberal, as you probably know, and I don't think in the American left, Ocasio-Cortez sense of the word. I'm a classical liberal in terms of my political philosophy, and I err on the side of allowing people to say what they need to say or want to say, and then protecting their right to do so. I may not agree with it. I may vehemently disagree with the waving of the South African flag at events. I think it's hurtful, and I think it is insensitive to the suffering of so many of our fellow South Africans, and what we should be doing is focusing on binding those wounds instead of aggravating them, so that we can heal and move forward as a country. But I would be reluctant to ban political parties. I'd be reluctant to ban songs. I'd be reluctant to ban what people say as different opinions, because I think that once you start to cut down on what a Steve Hofmeyr or what somebody else says, I think at some stage it's going to come back and bite you when it's uncomfortable for you to say what you want to say in the South African context. So I believe in the Nathan Sharansky test. Now, Nathan Sharansky said the test of, and he was a Russian political prisoner of war. And Nathan Sharansky said the test of any democracy is whether you can walk into the village square and say whatever you want to say without fear of arrest or persecution. I think that's the test we should use in South Africa if we're to keep our constitutional rights of freedom of expression, of freedom of speech, of freedom to impart political ideas right. Because today it may be you, Ernst, but tomorrow it may be me or others. And I think that's what we need to guard against. And we've seen what happens when a government decides what people should see, what people should say, and what people should watch. And we lived through 40 years of it, and I certainly don't want to take South Africa back down that road.
Oh yeah, I tweeted it out today, the idea that I think censorship shows that a society does not have confidence in itself. And if yes, I would also like to live in a world where nobody is offended and everyone can just have positive, constructive conversations. But at the same time, the spectrum of offense is so broad and so amazingly subjective that it's not possible to bubble wrap or childproof society, if you will. And that is just one of the hard realities of politics. And even though a lot of people want to bubble wrap society so that nobody is ever offended or doesn't feel any type of, doesn't see anything or hear anything controversial, I don't think it's possible. So I do think this is a very integral debate in terms of South Africa in general. I mean, freedom of speech is the very foundation that a free society is built on. If any of your other rights are infringed, you need freedom of speech first and foremost to be able to voice your concerns about it. Now, to move on from that, something that you did touch on that I also think is very important for the upcoming election and the future of South Africa is definitely social grants. Now, does the DA have a policy in place, or even are they contemplating a policy that could be used to, for example, wean people off social grants to a point where it's no longer a very substantial burden on the tax base, but also that a lot of people are not completely dependent on social grants for their livelihoods? Is there any type of policy in place or being considered in that regard?
Sure. Well, of course, you have to have a social grants policy in any society to protect the most vulnerable, unemployed. The problem that we have in South Africa is that 3 years ago, there was an intersection reached where the number of social grant recipients exceeded the number of taxpayers. That's not a sustainable situation for a country. And so our starting point is that, if you want to get people off welfare, you've got to get them into work. And that is the big dilemma we face in South Africa. Our economy is not growing because of the job-killing policies of our government. And the political uncertainty that they've created, which has driven away investors both locally and internationally. So the starting point to get people off welfare is to create the policy environment which creates stability for investment. a growing economy is the rising tide that lifts all boats. Whether you, as I said, you're living in Khayelitsha or Saxonwold, if an economy is growing and there's more opportunity for more South Africans, it will move the country forward as a whole. And so what you want to do is to give people work. And that's why Musi Maimani's been so passionate about our plan around putting a job in every home, to making sure that we grow employment in South Africa. Having chatted and interacted with South Africans who living in a variety of circumstances around the country, people don't want to be on welfare. Speaking to a father who has indignity of 6 or 7 years of unemployment, he said to me, I don't feel like a man because I cannot provide for my family in the evenings. Now, that's his words, not mine. But it's that sort of pain that people are having to deal with because they don't have the dignity of work. So we've got to get South Africa working if we're going to get our people back to work. And that means policy certainty. It means making sure that we have an investment destination that attracts foreign direct investment, who bring with them large amounts of jobs, particularly labor-intensive work around manufacturing, agro-processing, and construction. And those are the three sectors that I think have suffered the most under policy uncertainty of the last few years. So bed down the policy, get people into South Africa, and nothing we do in the country, no law we pass, no regulation we go down, no government edict we passed should be immune to being filtered through the lens, is this going to grow the economy? Is this going to create jobs? And if we had put the minimum wage through that lens, we would never have gone down that road. It's going to cut 1 million jobs out of our economy and push another 1 million people into the unemployment queue. Would we have gone down the road of the sugar tax through that lens? Absolutely not. It's going to cost 340,000 jobs in the sugar cane industry, mainly low-level agricultural workers who are unskilled and are just simply not able to find work in the current environment. Would we have passed things like the Promotion and Protection of Investment Bill, which has now driven away foreign direct investment in a major way in South Africa? Would we have passed ridiculous visa regulations that keep tourists and their money from our shores? Absolutely not. So you need to be serious about job creation. If we can get people into work and off welfare, I think it's going to be better for all of us. People don't want to be on welfare. We've got to move them from welfare into work. And the only way we can do that is if we grow the economy at 3, 4, 6% and upwards to create that work in South Africa.
Now, something else that I'm very curious about is, seeing as the DA has performed so well on a municipal level, why are there, and there's a bit of a spicy question, why are there so many service delivery protests predominantly in DA-run municipalities that seem to be winning awards for their performance?
Well, I think that if you look at the motivation behind many of these protests, and you look at what's happened in Alexandra in the last 2 weeks, you look what's happened in Tshwane the last 2 weeks, and in parts of Cape Town, this is a deliberate attempt by the ANC to discredit the DA's record on government. What they can't do is take away the fact that in DA-run municipalities, you've got more chance of finding a job, you've got more chance of having electricity and water in your home, and you've got more chance of economic success and having your children in a school that's actually going to keep them there until matric and equip them for the economy. And the ANC can't bear that. I mean, Parliament even wrote a letter to Helen Zille to congratulate her on the tremendous achievements that have been made under her government. And so the ANC can't counter that with good governance examples anywhere else. They've got no metro that they can hold up and say, look what we've done as opposed to what the DA's done. And if you look at what's happened in eThekwini over the course of the last 2 weeks, it's been trashed and destroyed by ANC internal infighting and poor governance. They've got no alternative answer to the DA's good track record. So the only thing they can do is try and shut that down. But what they're doing is turning people against themselves. And that's, the more you disrupt services, the more you burn things, the more you have these little ANC branch meetings, then try and portray them as a massive Alexandra movement, the more people see through your lack of ideas and your lack of alternatives. And we'd be love to go into an election head to head with the ANC, where they've done well in a metro, and we're competing against metrics. The truth of the matter is there's no metro in the country the ANC can bring close to Cape Town. There's no provincial government the ANC can bring close to what we've done in the Western Cape. And so they try to destroy what people are doing right in order to defend what they are doing wrong.
Now, something that I also want to know about is whether do you think the DA and the ANC are closer than the ANC and the EFF? Where's the most overlap in terms of the three parties? And then also as a second question, what then in that case makes the DA so unique compared to the 48 other parties that we're seeing run this year?
Well, I think it depends what part of the ANC you're talking about, and that is essentially the problem we have in South Africa, is that there's no one ANC. You've got factions, and it's very obvious. You've got the Magashule, Mabuza, Duarte, Zuma faction in the ANC that are, I think, a lot closer to the EFF's policies than anybody else. And I don't think that the hinterland for the DA or the hinterland for South Africa lies in the EFF or the left. I think the hinterland for our future and the new trajectory that I spoke about lies around reforming around the center. So bringing like-minded people from different parties together around a center. You know, we've got center, you could argue center right in the DA, slightly center left in some parts of the ANC, radical left in some parts of the ANC. So I think that the sooner we can see that split in the ANC, which I'm hoping that a poorer showing in this election will bring for Mr. Ramaphosa, would start to precipitate that split in the ANC, because that centre won't hold. And many of the reforms that Ramaphosa said he wants to bring will be bitterly opposed by people in his own party, in his own NEC, and in his own top six. So it's going to be very interesting to see that develop, which completely makes a lie of the Peter Bruce, Max Dupree article that the way to fix what's wrong is strengthen the ANC. The answer lies in weakening the ANC, fostering that split within the ANC, so we can move to a centre government that keeps the radical left out of the political powers in South Africa. I think that our future lies around the centre and developing that centre and being part of a centre coalition, which means that we've got to get as many chips as possible on the table in this high-stakes poker game that's going to come in South African politics. So I say to those people in the Bruce and Dupree camp, you're wrong. No. The answer lies in the best gift we can give South Africa on the 8th is a strong, growing DA at the center of politics, which is going to be able to partner with other parties to be able to form that rational center to keep the Marxist, socialists, Chavez, Mugabe-style politics out on the left and protect our future and get us onto that new trajectory. Because if we go down the road of socialism and the EFF and the left of the ANC, it is a cul-de-sac, the destination which we all know, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, every other country that's gone down that socialist route.
Now, seeing as you're talking about coalitions and partnerships, is there any specific party or parties at the moment that you've identified as some parties that you would easily work with, or where you have enough value and policy overlap that it would be an easy or a no-brainer coalition?
Well, as I say, it's very difficult to determine that, because what parties say and what they do are two different things. So, you know, the ANC says that they're pro-market, but then they, you know, want to nationalize the Reserve Bank, expropriate private property, nationalize pensions and et cetera through prescribed assets. So it's very, very difficult. The EFF would be very difficult to go into any form of national coalition with. A lot easier at a local government level, because the pernicious aspects of their ideology, nationalization, expropriation, are not possible at a local government level. I think that it would be very difficult to go into a coalition with EFF at a national level, because they are the antithesis of what we stand for. So we would not go into coalition with any party that believes in nationalization, that wants to expropriate without compensation and the like. So that would preclude automatically a party like the EFF, which is pushing those as their main policy agenda. We would rather coalesce and work with parties that share our values and principles and work towards building that rational center in politics, rather than just simply being expedient and going into coalitions with the radical socialists on the left, which I think would damage both the DA and the future of South Africa quite dramatically.
Now, something that I do need to touch on, something that you've been, as a party, catching a lot of flack for, was the idea of using the messaging that a vote for a smaller party is a wasted vote. Now, firstly, my question would be, why is it better to vote for the DA than a smaller party? Surely it's not a wasted vote to vote for a small party that more closely aligns with your policies or your values, or is that actually a wasted vote? Is there any reason why it is better to vote for the DA than a smaller party?
Sure, Ernst, and you would have seen a lot of stuff on social media around, people doing things on whiteboards and moving Smarties around, showing how it's not a wasted vote. Well, there are two ways it is a wasted vote. One, there are thousands upon thousands of votes in the last election that were lost because people voted for a party that didn't get a single seat in a provincial legislature or the National Assembly. But there's also a practical, outcome. And so, yes, in a political textbook, you can open to the page of proportional representation and it'll show you it's not a wasted vote. But let me just give you a practical experience as the chief whip of the DA in Parliament. There are over 34 committees in Parliament. They meet on a Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in the National Assembly. If you've got 4 seats or 8 seats in Parliament, it means that there are a variety of committees sitting every single day where you will not have a single representative. It also means that smaller parties only get a right to ask questions every second or third oral question session, questions to the president only every second question session, and you only have, as I say, there's committees where you are not even represented. The DA has 2 members of Parliament in every single committee, and I think we've done a good job in stopping the ANC and delaying them from amending the Constitution in the 5th Parliament. We've stopped the Road Accident Fund Bill, which would have denied people the right to use attorneys to fight their road accident fund cases. We've been able to break quorums. We've been able to block legislation. Now, what I could have done with 3 members on each of those committees, I could have changed the world in politics in South Africa. So people need to think very, very carefully. Yes, the notion of voting for a small party may appeal to some, but really there are some big fights coming, Ernst. We're going to be fighting against expropriation without compensation, against amending the Constitution, against prescribed assets, which want to push people's retirement fund savings into bad government debt, wanting to take people's right to own firearms in South Africa for self-defense away. We've got some key battles around state capture to come and how those people are prosecuted. This is not a time to play games. It's a time to get behind, I think, the one party that has shown it can make a difference and is doing so and has been able to bring that difference. Give me 3 members in each of those committees. I can do miracles with those in Parliament.
Well, now that I've touched on the main criticism you've received in terms of messaging or rhetoric, there is another big policy criticism that you've received, and that is on the matter of BEE. Now, I know that the DA does have a BEE policy framework, or at least it does not reject BEE. Now, my question would be, how does the DA's BEE policies differ from the ANC's, who has just been used for cadre deployment and as an absolute abuse of power and a use to just further corruption? Rather than, I mean, a lot of the corruption that we're seeing today has been brought about or facilitated by the BEE policies that were brought in with good intentions. Sure. How does the DA's BEE policies differ from these absolutely disastrous policies that we've seen under the ANC rule?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we start from the point that you've got to have redress in South Africa. You can't say we've got a fair society where half the runners start from the Comrades Marathon start in Durban, the other half start in Hillcrest. And then you get to the end and say we've had a fair outcome. We've had almost a century of legislative dispossession and marginalization of mainly black South Africans in the country. We've got to address that to get everybody back to the starting point. So who are the biggest victims of the BEE policies in South Africa? Now, everyone would probably say, well, white South Africans. The truth of the matter is the biggest victims of BEE, as the ANC have implemented in South Africa, are actually black South Africans. Black South African households have got 10% poorer over the course of these BEE policies. There's been nothing broad-based and there's been nothing empowering about them apart from creating an elite. So what we are saying, and we've had a debate in our party about how you overcome those inequalities and get everybody onto the starting line. And what we've said is that you've got to start moving away from race as the only criteria for empowerment. And that's why our policy focuses on what we call an inclusive empowerment model, which means that there's a variety of proxies for disadvantage in South Africa. Race is not the only proxy for disadvantage. You can't tell me that Andile Ramaphosa is less advantaged than a person of the same age who's living in a informal settlement or white informal settlement on the outskirts of Pretoria. It's completely farcical. So you've got to move away from using race as the sole criteria, and that is the debate that we've been having and in the direction we're moving, and looking at a variety of metrics for how you measure disadvantage in South Africa, income, education, etc. There's a variety of them. But in order to overcome inequality and to get people onto the starting line, I think the laser focus, and this is where the trick has been missed, is on education. And this is the biggest dereliction of duty, I believe, of this government over the last 25 years, is how our education system has been allowed to just simply fail. Because we had a substandard education for Black South Africans particularly. To every R1 spent on a Black South African, R7 was spent on the education of a white South African. And we live with the outcomes of that. And that's why the focus, like a laser beam for any government, and would be a priority for a DA government, is fixing the education system. So it doesn't matter whether you're living in a rural school or in a school in Sandton, the level of education, the quality of teaching, and the resources that are used to teach you will be exactly the same. So that we're able to bring everybody, regardless of where you are, up to a same starting point, so we can move forward together. And so I believe that we have to focus on an inclusive empowerment model that doesn't just simply rely on race as a proxy. And we've got to do something that's far more broad-based than the current regime, which has just made a variety of self-reinforcing billionaires who keep getting richer every year, when the majority of Black South African households are actually getting poorer.
Right. Now, but I do think on that topic, before we move on, I think that's one of the DA's maybe blunders in terms of messaging, in terms of specifically that policy, seeing as it is one of the biggest focus points for your detractors, but also people within the DA or DA supporters that are feeling a bit disillusioned. I mean, just a while back, and he might have been quoted out of context, but I can't really see how. Musi Mayamane was quoted saying that race is indeed the main proxy for disadvantage. And I think that also upsets a lot of people. But what you're saying there actually sounds pretty much a bit off the general messaging that we're seeing. So maybe in the future, you could be a bit more clear about your multiple proxies that you just talked about. I mean, that is a completely different message than a lot of people have been interpreting from many people in the DA, or from your main voices out there, coming from MPs or coming from people representing the DA. But to move on from that topic, something just a bit more of a less serious question. You as a experienced politician and as a representative from the DA, what are your impressions of a party that seems to be challenging you on a provincial basis, the secessionists down south, the Cape Party? Just your personal impressions of the movement that seems to be germinating there.
Yeah, look, I mean, I've met with Jack, I've debated with Jack. I've actually even stolen a book I expropriated without compensation, unintentionally. Jack's book, The Architects of Poverty, which I've still got a return from. So I hope he's not watching this evening. Look, I mean, I think there's space in politics for everybody, but this election, frankly, I think is far too important to be having these types of arguments around secession. It's unlikely it will happen. It's unlikely it will go ahead. And a party pushing for it, that's fine. That's what our democracy is all about. And obviously, if they make the threshold for a seat in Parliament or in the National Assembly or in the provincial legislature, all well and good. But, I've seen these one-issue parties come and go. So we've had the Matatiel party, the ARC in Parliament. They got elected on the guise that they were going to bring Matatiel back into KwaZulu-Natal out of the Eastern Cape. Look, I mean, the truth of the matter is a limit to what you can do with one or two members of Parliament, and that's the truth of the matter. So I think the answer to what the Cape Party is trying to do lies actually in winning more provinces away from the ANC, because if you're able to win more provinces it means that when the Division of Revenue Act comes to a place like the National Council of Provinces, you're able to block it and be able to make sure there are more resources going to the various provinces. So I think the answer to many of the gripes of parties like the Cape Party actually lies around strengthening a core alternative against the ANC. And that core alternative is the DA. Now, we're not perfect. You're never going to see a party that ticks every one of the boxes that you like. But I certainly think if you want a chance of ensuring a fairer deal, particularly for provinces, then our party, I think, is the place where people should be putting their cross.
Just from my own personal perspective, I just always look to Catalonia, where the Catalonians took to the streets in their millions, and they haven't even gotten their secession. So until I see at least a Cape Party march in Cape Town that is constituted out of at least 24 people, I'm not going to take an internet-based party that seriously. I think one of the people that I work with at AfriForum says, if you look at, for example, a party like Front National, they get less votes than likes on their Facebook page. And I think you can say the exact same thing about a party like the Cape Party. They're very interesting, a very interesting development in South African politics. I mean, Cape secession is nothing new. It's been since 1994, people have been talking about it. But not seeing real world impact, just from my personal experience in politics, tells me a lot in terms of it's very easy to set up a petition and get through online engagement, get a few thousand signatures. It's a whole thing, another thing entirely, to get people to put their face to the movement and to go represent that movement in the streets and to really support it with their money and also their identities. So at the same time, while I see it as a very interesting idea and something that I will be keeping a close eye on, I do not see it as viable. Just looking at the other secession attempts that have happened across the world, like, for example, like I said, Catalonia, where, I mean, if you wanted to see a secession happen, it would have been there. I mean, everything was on their side. They had millions of people in the streets. They had a referendum. They had politicians that were willing to back the idea, that were in power. And here we are still sitting without a Catalonian state. So I think a lot of the rhetoric around such smaller parties specifically, as you said, in terms of single issue parties, is that they feed off idealism and people's ideas of a utopia almost. And at the end of the day, I think we need to look at more a practical vote, even though I don't completely agree that a vote for a small party is a wasted vote. Me personally, I would much rather vote for a party that closest party that represents my values than to vote for a lesser of two evils. But on that note, I'd like to end off with just asking your predictions for the 8th of May, which is now coming up very closely. Now, just your predictions for the top 3 parties. Where do you think they will fall?
57 to 58 for the ANC, 24 to 25 for the DA, and 9 to 11 for the EFF.
And what are you basing are you basing your predictions on internal polling you're doing, or are there any other?
It's a variety of things that we.
Because the one thing that I've also seen people talk about is that they're struggling to find a reliable poll source in terms of.
Something exists anymore in the modern world. I mean, if one looks at what happened with Trump, what happens with Brexit, polls have shown that the only poll that matters is the poll on election day. And I think we can predict as much as we like, and it's up to the voters to decide. And I think that's right. But I certainly think that we're going to see growth for the DA. I think we're going to see a decline in the ANC. And I think that, unfortunately, I think the EFF are going to grow slightly this election, as the ANC starts to fray around the left. And I think that will also want to be one of the things that helps precipitate that split within the ANC, because it's going to just push them and pull them even further leftwards. And that's something which is going to force the center of politics in South Africa, the rational center, to come together to keep them out of power and make sure that they never, ever, ever get their hands onto those levers, because the road that they're going to take us down as South Africa will be poverty, suffering, hunger, and an economy that just will take decades to recover.
All right. Well, we are now reaching the end of this interview. Thank you very much for coming on, John. And I'm just going to give you one final opportunity to leave the audience with your final message, the last thing you'd like to send out to the world before we say goodnight to the audience?
Sure. Well, I think that we've shown before in South Africa that we are our best when we stand together. And that's why the DA's message of building one South Africa for all, I think, is the right message for South Africa. You can be a camp fighter for minority rights, for language rights, for cultural rights, but those rights are always better protected in a big organization where we all stand up for each other's rights. That party, I think, is the DA. People have an opportunity to change. If we continue on the current trajectory, we're going to end up in a very, very bad place. Those people who see Cyril Ramaphosa as the savior are misguided because he has sat around the same table with the same people making the same bad decisions that got us where we want to be. If we want to see change in South Africa, we've got to do what the people in the Western Cape did 10 years ago and change who's sitting around that table. Only your vote has the power to make that change and bring that change. And so you've got to use that vote wisely next week, Wednesday. The ANC have cut your power. It's time to cut their power. Be an agent of change. Show who has the real power in South Africa, and that is the citizens. But whatever you do, whether you're going to vote for my party or not, just make sure you get out there and vote. Far too many people sacrificed far too much for the right to vote for South Africans. And sitting at home means you're a bystander in your own country. You've got to be a participant. I want to say stand with us on the frontiers of freedom as we protect individual freedom. The right to ensure your pensions aren't abused, the right to ensure your property is not expropriated, the right to defend our constitution, the rule of law, and a market-based economy in South Africa. Those are the things we believe need to be non-negotiable in South Africa, and those are the things we're going to go and fight hard for in the 6th Democratic Parliament. The more you strengthen our arm, the more we're able to fight for you and your rights and to ensure that we get South Africa onto that new trajectory of hope and opportunity. Thank you.
Oh, no, that's an excellent way to end it off on. I'm just going to acknowledge some people in the chat. Thank you. We have some high-profile people listening in. I would just like to thank Ronaldo and the Roman. Roman Kabanak seems to be doing some opposition research, seeing as he's a ZACP man. I hope he's learned some things he can use before Wednesday. And just I see a lot of my international followers tuned in. Just for your information, the South African election will be on the 8th of May, this coming Wednesday. And you will be, I think social media will be flooded with the latest updates. So I don't think you will have a shortage of just information in terms of what's going on here. And now I just would like to thank the rest of you all for tuning in. We had an excellent audience. I mean, this was definitely one of the biggest shows this year so far. And an excellent way to end off my election-themed series. This was definitely the season finale that this channel needed. So thank you very much for tuning in. You can help out the show by subscribing and liking the video and also sharing it afterwards. It will be available for playback for those who weren't able to watch the whole thing or who only tuned in late right now. I saw some people sneaking in through the back door and taking a seat. But yeah, something I also found very interesting that I will end it on is that my audience is not notoriously very tolerant towards the DA, but they do seem to be very fond of you, John. They do seem to, just by looking at some of the comments that I've seen tonight, the majority of people seem to have a lot of respect for what you are doing, and you do seem to have softened some of their views on the DA. It hasn't been that spicy in the live chat tonight. So I would just like to thank you for coming on. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to, especially now in crunch time with the election just a few days away, for giving us the time of day to just come talk to us, help me inform my audience, to help them make an informed vote, whether what you said tonight convinced them not to vote DA or vote for the DA. I think that still would count as informing them a little bit in my own capacity. So thank you very much for coming out and talking to us for an hour of your day. And thank you for everyone that tuned in also through an hour of your day. I know it's not the easiest of things to do on a Sunday night. Everyone feels lazy and would rather watch. I mean, this is not Game of Thrones after all. But thanks again, guys. This will be the end of my election-themed stream of consciousness episodes, but they will definitely be back with other politically themed guests in the future, and I will maybe do an election analysis after Wednesday, so definitely tune in for that. Cheers, guys. Have a good one.